There is a photograph taken on November 7, 1885, at Craigellachie, British Columbia. In it, a group of well-dressed white men surround a railway spike. One of them, Donald Smith, a director of the Canadian Pacific Railway, is bent forward, hammer in hand, about to drive the last spike into the last section of track that connected Canada from coast to coast. The men in the photograph are smiling. They are celebrating. And they are celebrating something real, the completion of one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. A railway that crossed mountains, carved through rock, bridged rivers, and stitched together a country that had no other means of holding itself in one piece. Look at the photograph carefully. Look at every face in it. There is not a single Chinese worker in the frame. The men who built the most dangerous sections of that railway, who drilled the tunnels, who handled the nitroglycerin, who died in numbers that were never accurately recorded, are absent from the moment of celebration. They were absent from the compensation. They were absent from the history. They built Canada, and Canada spent the next century pretending they hadn't. The Canadian Pacific Railway was not simply a transportation project. It was a political necessity. When British Columbia agreed to join Confederation in 1871, it did so on one condition: that the federal government would build a transcontinental railway connecting the new province to the rest of Canada within 10 years. The promise was almost impossible to keep. The geography of British Columbia was unlike anything railway engineers had encountered in eastern Canada. The Fraser Canyon, the Rogers Pass, the Kicking Horse Pass. Mountain terrain so extreme that entire sections of the proposed route were considered, by the engineering standards of the time, essentially unbuildable. The CPR needed workers who would attempt the impossible sections, who would work in conditions that white laborers were refusing, who could be paid wages low enough to make the economics of the mountain sections viable. In 1880, the CPR began recruiting Chinese workers, initially from California, where large Chinese communities had formed during the gold rush, and later directly from Guangdong province in southern China. They arrived by the thousands, and the railway that Canada celebrates as the achievement that made it a nation was built, in its most critical sections, on their backs. The men who came to build the CPR's mountain sections were not fleeing desperation alone, though many were. Guangdong province in the 1880s was experiencing severe economic hardship. The combination of overpopulation, crop failures, and the aftermath of the Taiping Rebellion had created conditions in which emigration was not a choice but a survival strategy. Labor recruiters, some working for the CPR, some operating independently, arrived in Guangdong with promises of good wages and steady work in the New World. The wages offered were real. What the recruiters did not always explain was the nature of the work, or the conditions, or the fact that the men would be expected to pay for their own passage to Canada, a debt that would be deducted from their wages before they saw a dollar. Many arrived already indebted. They stepped off the boats in Victoria or Vancouver, with their passage costs hanging over them, and were immediately directed toward work camps in the mountain interior that were days or weeks of travel away. They were, from the moment of arrival, trapped in a financial structure that was designed to capture them. Not by force, by arithmetic. The wage differential between Chinese and white workers on the CPR is one of the most documented and least discussed facts in Canadian history. White workers on the railway earned between $1.50 and $2.50 per day. They were provided with food and accommodation as part of their employment. Chinese workers earned $1 per day. They were required to pay for their own food and accommodation out of that dollar. After those deductions, many were left with between 50 and 75 cents for a full day of work, in conditions that were, in the mountain sections, genuinely life-threatening. And here is the detail that makes the wage structure something more than simple exploitation. The CPR's own internal documents acknowledged that the work being assigned to Chinese workers was more dangerous than the work being assigned to white workers. The tunnel drilling, the cliff face blasting, the handling of explosives in confined spaces, The men doing the most dangerous work were paid the least, and paid less than half of what their white counterparts received for less dangerous work. This was not a market outcome, it was a policy. And the policy was enforced by a company that was simultaneously receiving enormous federal land grants and government subsidies to complete the railway. The Canadian government subsidized the exploitation. In both directions. The Fraser Canyon section of the CPR was the most dangerous construction project in 19th-century North American history. The canyon walls drop hundreds of feet to the river below. The rock face is sheer, unstable in places, and offers almost no natural foothold for construction equipment or workers. The only way to build a railway through the Fraser Canyon was to carve it, to blast ledges out of solid rock, hand-drill holes for explosives, and remove the debris by hand. Chinese workers were lowered down the canyon walls in wicker baskets, hand-woven containers suspended by ropes, to drill holes in the rock face and set explosive charges. When the charge was ready to detonate, they would signal to the men above and be hauled up as quickly as possible before the blast. If the signal was missed, if the rope slipped, if the basket gave way, if the charge detonated early, there was no safety system, no protocol, no equipment designed for the purpose. The men in the baskets had no protection beyond the rope and the speed of the men above them. The number of Chinese workers who died in the Fraser Canyon has never been established with precision. Contemporary accounts from white supervisors mention deaths in ways that suggest they were considered an operational cost, rather than a tragedy requiring documentation. The bodies of workers killed in accidents were, in some documented cases, simply buried where they fell, beneath the railway bed they had died building. For the tunnel sections, the CPR initially used black powder as the explosive of choice, but black powder was too slow for the pace the company needed. In the early 1880s, the CPR switched to nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin in the 1880s was extraordinarily unstable. Unlike modern dynamite, which was developed precisely to make nitroglycerin safer to handle, raw nitroglycerin could detonate from heat, from friction, from being dropped, from almost any mechanical disturbance if conditions were wrong. Chinese workers mixed and handled this substance in mountain camps that had no refrigeration, no temperature control, and no facilities designed for the safe management of unstable explosives. They carried it to the drill sites, they poured it into holes in the rock, they set the charges. The accident rate was by any standard catastrophic. Premature detonations, tunnel collapses, rockfalls triggered by blasting that was imprecisely timed or imprecisely placed. The CPR kept records of white worker fatalities with reasonable consistency. The records of Chinese worker fatalities are fragmentary, inconsistent, and almost certainly significant undercounts. Historical estimates of the number of Chinese workers killed during CPR construction range from several hundred to over 1,000. The most commonly cited figure is 600. 600 men, buried in the mountains, or in unmarked graves, or beneath the railway itself. And when the last spike was driven, not one of them was in the photograph. The death toll on the CPR was not only from accidents. Chinese workers in the mountain camps faced nutritional conditions that were, by modern understanding, almost guaranteed to produce illness. Their diet, funded from their already depleted wages, consisted primarily of rice, dried salmon, and whatever vegetables could be obtained in the remote interior. It was insufficient in calories for the physical demands of the work and severely deficient in the nutrients that prevent certain diseases. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, killed Chinese workers in the mountain camps in numbers that the CPR's own medical officers documented. The disease is entirely preventable. Fresh vegetables and fruit prevent it. The men could not afford fresh vegetables and fruit on what remained of their wages after food and accommodation were deducted. They died of a preventable disease while building a railway for a company that was receiving tens of millions of dollars in government subsidies and land grants. Beyond scurvy, the camps were breeding grounds for cholera and dysentery. Sanitation facilities were primitive or non-existent. Water sources were shared and frequently contaminated. The men slept in crowded tents or rough wooden shelters with no heating in winter temperatures that could drop to 30 below zero. The CPR's medical response to illness among Chinese workers was consistently inadequate. Medical care available to white workers was not equally available to Chinese workers. Men who became too ill to work were, in some documented cases, simply discharged, left in the camps or in the nearest town with no employment, no wages, no passage home, and no support of any kind. On November 7, 1885, the same day the last spike was driven at Craigellachie, the Canadian government passed the Chinese Immigration Act. The timing was not coincidental. The railway was complete. The Chinese workers who had built its most dangerous sections were no longer needed, and British Columbia's white population, which had been agitating for restrictions on Chinese immigration for years, was now politically powerful enough to get what it wanted. The act imposed a $50 head tax on all Chinese immigrants entering Canada. $50 represented approximately 2 months' wages for a Chinese laborer in 1885. The explicit purpose of the tax was to make Chinese immigration financially prohibitive, to prevent the men who had built the railway from bringing their families to join them, to prevent the formation of permanent Chinese-Canadian communities. It did not work as completely as intended. Some men paid the tax, some families came, so in 1900 the tax was raised to $100. In 1903 it was raised again to $500, equivalent to 2 full years of wages. Between 1885 and 1923, the Canadian government collected approximately $23 million in head tax revenue from Chinese immigrants. In 1923, the government abandoned the head tax entirely, not because it had decided the policy was unjust, but because it had decided a simpler approach was more effective. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1923 banned Chinese immigration to Canada almost entirely. The ban remained in effect until 1947. The head tax and the immigration ban produced a specific and devastating social consequence that has almost no equivalent in Canadian history. Chinese men who had come to Canada to work, who had survived the railway, who had found work in the service industries of British Columbia and the Prairie provinces, could not bring their wives and children to join them. The financial barrier was too high, and after 1923 the legal barrier was absolute. The result was a generation of Chinese-Canadian men who lived their entire adult lives in what became known as bachelor communities, men-only social worlds centered on rooming houses, clan associations, and community organizations, in cities that surrounded them with white families living ordinary domestic lives that were legally and financially inaccessible to them. Some men returned to China. Some sent money home for decades to wives and children they would not see again for 20 or 30 years, if ever. Some died in Canada alone, in rooming houses, in cities where they had lived for 50 years and remained legally foreign. The Canadian government had extracted their labor. It had collected tax revenue from them. It had benefited from their presence in every practical sense. And it had simultaneously constructed a legal framework specifically designed to ensure they could not build the kind of life that the labor was supposed to make possible. This is not incidental to Canadian history. It is Canadian history. It simply does not appear in the version that gets taught. In 2006, 121 years after the head tax was first imposed, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood in the House of Commons and issued a formal apology on behalf of the Canadian government. The apology acknowledged the head tax. It acknowledged the immigration ban. It acknowledged that these policies had caused significant harm to Chinese Canadians and their families. The government also announced symbolic payments of $20,000 each to surviving head taxpayers, of whom only a handful remained alive, and to the living spouses of deceased payers. The survivors who received the payment were, almost without exception, extremely elderly. The men who had actually paid the head tax, who had worked on the railway, who had lived in the bachelor communities, who had spent decades separated from their families by explicit government policy, were almost all dead. The $20,000 was symbolic, not restitution, not compensation in any meaningful economic sense. A gesture, genuine in intent, inadequate in scale, and approximately a century too late. The men in the wicker baskets got nothing. Their children got nothing. Their grandchildren received a ceremony and a check that did not cover a year's rent in Vancouver. The Canadian Pacific Railway still runs. The line through the Fraser Canyon, through the Rogers Pass, through the mountain sections that Chinese workers built with hand drills and wicker baskets and nitroglycerin, that line carries freight trains today, every day. The infrastructure that those men created with their labor and their lives is still in active commercial use. The CPR is a publicly traded company valued in the billions of dollars. It has changed hands and changed names and been restructured many times since 1885. But the physical railway, the one built on the backs of men who were paid half wages and buried without markers, is still generating revenue. Nobody has proposed that any portion of that revenue be directed toward the descendants of the men who built it. The question has not been seriously raised in any political forum. The railway runs, the freight moves, the money flows, and the men in the wicker baskets remain where they have always been, in the mountains, in the unmarked graves, absent from the photograph, absent from the accounting, in the cities of British Columbia, Victoria, Vancouver, New Westminster. The Chinese communities that formed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries built their own parallel world within a world that had made the official one inaccessible. Chinatowns were not simply ethnic neighborhoods, they were the physical consequence of exclusion. When Chinese residents were barred from white-owned hotels, they built their own rooming houses. When they were refused service in white-owned restaurants, they opened their own. When their children were segregated from white schools, they established their own language schools. The clan associations that organized these communities, the benevolent associations that provided mutual aid, dispute resolution, and social support to men who had no access to government social services, were the only institutional support available to Chinese Canadians for decades. They built all of this while being taxed specifically to fund a government that was simultaneously legislating their exclusion. The Chinatowns that tourists visit today in Victoria and Vancouver, the ones that appear on heritage walking tours and restaurant guides, are the physical legacy of that exclusion, beautiful in their way, and built entirely on the foundation of a system designed to make their residents' lives as constrained as possible. The descendants of the Chinese railway workers and head taxpayers live in Canada today. Some know their family history in detail, the grandfather who came over in 1882, who worked the canyon, who paid the head tax, who spent 30 years sending money to a wife he couldn't bring over, who died in a rooming house in Victoria in 1941. Some know it only in fragments. The photograph on a shelf, the story told once by an elderly relative and never fully explained. The gap in the family history that represents years when a man was here and his family was not, or years when he was here but couldn't quite be said to belong. The 2006 apology gave many of these families a public acknowledgement, a moment when the government of Canada stood up and said, "This happened, it was wrong, we are sorry." What it gave them was important. What it could not give them was the lost decades, the families that were never formed, the childhoods that happened without a father, the old age that happened without a son. Those losses are not in any ledger. They have no dollar value. They are simply the shape of what was taken and what an apology, however sincere, cannot return. Somewhere in the mountains of British Columbia, beneath a railway that has been running for over 140 years, there are men who were never given a name in any official record. They came from Guangdong province. They crossed the Pacific in the holds of ships. They were lowered down canyon walls in baskets. They mixed nitroglycerin with their bare hands. They died of scurvy in camps where fresh vegetables were a luxury they couldn't afford. They were buried where they fell, and the railway was built over them, and the trains ran, and the last spike was driven, and the photograph was taken, and not one of them was in it. Canada is a country built by people it has consistently refused to remember. The Chinese railway workers are among the most significant of those people, not because their story is the only one, but because the evidence of what they built is visible every single day, from every train window, in every mountain pass, in every tunnel carved from rock that is still in use. The railway is there. It has always been there. The question is whether Canada is ready to look at it honestly, to see not just the achievement, but the cost, and who paid it, and what they were given in return. This is Dark Canada, where the history underneath the history finally gets told. Subscribe, because this country was built by people who were written out of the story, and we are writing them back in.